In the sleepy village of St. Mary's Down, a farmer's shocking death by his own electrified fence sparks whispers of murder. Was it his bitter neighbor, his restless son, his trusted mechanic, or the ambitious land developer desperate for his farm? Join Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, as she unravels a web of greed, betrayal, and hidden motives. In just 12 gripping chapters, secrets buried in the fields come to light, proving no one can outwit the truth. Miss Marple. Chapter 1. The Shocking Discovery. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary's Down, curling around the ancient hedgerows like a cat seeking warmth. The village, nestled in a fold of the English countryside, was a place where time seemed to pause, where the rhythm of life followed the seasons and the gossip of neighbors. But on this particular July morning in 2025, a sharp cry shattered the stillness, echoing across the dew-soaked fields of Thomas Hale's farm. It was young Jenny, the barmaid from the Green Man, who found him. She had been cutting through the farm on her way home from an early shift, her boots damp from the grass, when she stumbled upon the grim scene. Thomas Hale, a robust man of 50, with a face weathered by sun and stubbornness, lay crumpled beside his electrified fence. His hand, calloused from years of toil, still clutched a wire, and the grass beneath him was scorched black, a silent testament to the violence of his end. The village constable, Mr. Perkins, a lanky young man with a nervous habit of adjusting his cap, arrived shortly after. He surveyed the scene with a mixture of dismay and inexperience, his notebook trembling slightly in his hand. An accident, no doubt, he declared, his voice loud to mask his uncertainty. Poor man must have tangled with the fence. These things happen. The small crowd that had gathered farmhands, a few curious villagers, and old Mr. Giles, the blacksmith, who had seen every tragedy in St. Mary's Down for nigh on 70 years, murmured in dissent. Thomas Hale was no fool with his equipment. He knew his fence, a simple system meant to nudge errant sheep, not to kill. Whispers of foul play rippled through the group, carried on the damp morning air. In the drawing room of Mrs. Clara Bantry's cottage, Rose Cottage, the news reached Miss Jane Marple, who was visiting for a quiet summer away from her own village of St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bantry, a stout woman with a penchant for bright scarves and brighter gossip, burst into the room, her face flushed with the thrill of calamity. Jane, you'll never believe it. Poor Thomas Hale, dead by his own fence. Electrocuted, they say. Perkins is calling it an accident, but nobody believes that for a moment. She sank into an armchair, fanning herself with a copy of the village newsletter. Miss Marple, seated by the window with her knitting, looked up, her pale blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles. Her needles clicked rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to Mrs. Bantry's agitation. She was a small, neat woman, her white hair drawn into a tidy bun, her demeanor so unassuming that one might overlook the mind that worked like a finely tuned trap. Electrocuted, you say? She murmured, her tone mild but her interest piqued. How very curious. A farmer like Mr. Hale would know his fence, would he not? One does not survive 50 years in the fields by being careless. Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. Exactly. Thomas was as stubborn as a mule, but sharp as a tack. That farm's been in his family for generations. He'd never sell, no matter how much that developer fellow, Mr. Voss, pressed him. And there's talk, Jane, talk of bad blood with his neighbor, Amos Trent, over some boundary nonsense, and young Peter, his son, was seen shouting at him just last week. Oh, it's a proper tangle. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second, a sign to those who knew her that her mind was already sifting through the threads of the tale. Bad blood, she repeated softly, and a fence that kills. How very modern, and yet, how very old. People, Clara, are so predictable in their passions. She resumed her knitting, but her thoughts were far from the pale blue wool in her hands. She recalled a similar incident in St. Mary Mead, years ago. when a gardener's death by a faulty lawnmower had proven to be no accident at all. Accidents, she said, almost to herself, are so often not what they seem. Mrs. Bantry, sensing the stirrings of her friend's formidable mind, leaned forward. "You'll look into it, won't you, Jane? You've a way of seeing things others miss. The village is all aflutter, and poor Thomas deserves better than a rushed verdict." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes returning to her knitting. "I shall take a walk this afternoon, Clara. The fields are so lovely this time of year, and one hears such interesting things when one listens." Her tone was gentle, but Mrs. Bantry knew that look the look of a woman who had unraveled more mysteries than most detectives could dream of. As the mist began to lift outside, Miss Marple's thoughts were already weaving a pattern, one that might catch a killer in its delicate strands. Chapter 2. The farmer's world. The sun had burned away the morning mist by the time Miss Jane Marple set out from Rose Cottage, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path that wound toward Thomas Hale's farm. Mrs. Clara Bantry, ever eager for a mystery, insisted on accompanying her, her bright scarf fluttering like a flag of enthusiasm. The air was warm, scented with clover and the faint temps of earth, and the fields of St. Mary's Down stretched before them, a patchwork of green and gold under a sky of untroubled blue. Miss Marple, with her neat black handbag and a straw hat, tilted against the sun, moved with the unhurried grace of one who knew the value of observation. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's behind her spectacles, missed nothing, not the lark darting above, nor the faint ruts in the lane where a heavy vehicle had passed. Hale's farm, known as Willow Bend, was a study in order and pride. The fields were meticulously tended, the wheat standing tall and ready for harvest, the pastures dotted with contented sheep. The farmhouse itself, a sturdy stone building with a slate roof, stood at the heart of the property, its windows gleaming in the sunlight. Around the perimeter ran the electrified fence, a simple affair of wire and wooden posts, designed to keep livestock from straying. It was this fence, now infamous, that had claimed Thomas Hale's life, and Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it. As they approached, "Such a practical thing, a fence," she remarked to Mrs. Bantry, "and yet, how easily it becomes something else entirely." Mrs. Bantry, puffing slightly from the walk, nodded. "It's dreadful, Jane. Thomas was so particular about this place. He'd never let a wire go faulty. And to think, all this land is what that developer, Mr. Voss, has been after for months. He's got plans for houses, shops, goodness knows what else. Thomas wouldn't hear of it, of course. Said it'd ruin the village." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind at work. "A man who loves his land," she said softly, "is often a man with enemies. Let us see what Willow Bend can tell us." They followed the path toward the farmhouse, where a farmhand, a wiry lad, named Tommy Gibbs, was mending a gate. He looked up, his face still pale with the shock of his employer's death, and touched his cap respectfully. "Morning, ma'am," he said to Miss Marple, then nodded to Mrs. Bantry. "Terrible thing. What happened to Mr. Hale? Never thought I'd see the day." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, disarming. "A great loss to the village, I'm sure. You worked for Mr. Hale long, Mr. Gibbs?" "3 years, ma'am," Tommy replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "He was a good boss, fair but firm. Knew every inch of this place. That fence, though he checked it himself every week, said it was his responsibility. Did he now?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes were keen. "And did anyone else tend to it? A mechanic, perhaps?" Tommy hesitated, glancing toward the fence, as if it might overhear. "Mr. Finch, the mechanic, came by now and then. Fixed the generator when it acted up. But Mr. Hale didn't like folks meddling with his setup. Liked to keep things in his own hands." Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, chimed in. "And what about that neighbor, Mr. Trent?" I hear he and Thomas were at odds over the boundary. Tommy's face tightened. Aye, they had words. Mr. Trent claimed a strip of land along the north field was his. Said it had been in his family before the Hales bought it. They argued something fierce last month, right out by the hedge there. He pointed to a line of hawthorn that separated Hale's land from Amos Trent's smaller farm. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking in her mind, though her hands were still. And Mr. Hale's son, Peter, did he take an interest in the farm? Tommy's expression grew guarded. Young Peter. He's not much for farming, ma'am. Always talking about London, city life. He and his dad didn't see eye to eye. I heard Em shouting a few days back, over by the barn. Peter was on about selling, but Mr. Hale wouldn't have it. Thank you, Mr. Gibbs, Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as the breeze. You've been most helpful. As they moved on, she glanced at Mrs. Bantry, a young man who wants to sell, a neighbor who quarrels, and a fence that kills. How very interesting. They continued their walk, circling the farm's perimeter. The fence was unremarkable at first glance, its wires taut and evenly spaced, the posts weathered but solid. Miss Marple paused near the spot where Hale had been found, marked now by a patch of blackened grass. She crouched, her movements surprisingly spry for her age, and examined the ground. The soil was disturbed, as if someone had dug recently, and a faint glint of metal caught her eye, a small screw, half buried, not the sort used in the fence's construction. She tucked it into her handbag without comment, her face betraying nothing. Mrs. Bantry, watching her friend, could scarcely contain her curiosity. What do you make of it, Jane? It's all so sinister. And that developer, Voss, he's been hovering like a vulture. I saw him at the village hall last week, all smiles and promises about progress. But Thomas wouldn't budge, and now this. Miss Marple straightened, brushing a speck of dust from her glove. Mr. Voss, yes. Ambition is a powerful thing, Clara. It can make a man do what he would not otherwise consider. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the edge of Hale's land met a field owned by Reginald Voss's company. A bulldozer sat idle there, a stark reminder of the future pressing against the past. Let us pay a call on the farmhouse, she suggested. There is much to learn from a man's home. The farmhouse was as Thomas Hale had left it, a place of practical comfort. The kitchen, with its heavy oak table and chipped teapot, spoke of a man who lived simply but well. A photograph on the mantel showed Hale with a young Peter, both smiling, though the boy's eyes held a restless spark even then. Miss Marple lingered over the photograph, noting the absence of a woman's touch. Mrs. Hale passed some years ago, I understand. She asked Mrs. Bantry. Oh yes, Mrs. Bantry replied. Cancer, poor thing, when Peter was just a lad. Thomas raised him alone, which might explain the boy's wild streak. He's been in and out of the village, always chasing something bigger than St. Mary's. Down. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of a ledger on the table. It was open to a page detailing the farm's finances. The numbers neat but showing strained debts, not crippling but persistent. A farm is a heavy burden, she murmured, and a son who does not wish to carry it. Their exploration was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Phipps, the postmistress who had come to deliver a parcel. She was a small, bustling woman with a nose for news, and her eyes widened at the sight of Miss Marple. Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it awful? Poor Mr. Hale, and him so careful. I saw him just 2 days ago, checking that fence like always. Said he'd had a row with young Peter again, about selling to that Mr. Voss. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained serene. Did he say anything about Mr. Voss, Mrs. Phipps? The postmistress leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Only that he'd had enough of Voss's pestering. Said the man came by last week with another offer. all charm and big promises. But Thomas wouldn't hear of it. Said this land was his legacy, for Peter, whether the boy wanted it or not. And did you see anyone else near the farm recently? Miss Marple asked, her tone as casual as if she were inquiring about the weather. Mrs. Phipps thought for a moment. Well, there was Mr. Finch, the mechanic, tinkering with something by the fence last week. And Mr. Trent, of course, always prowling about, muttering about his boundary. Oh, and I saw Mr. Voss's car, that fancy black one, parked down the lane one evening, though I couldn't say when exactly. It was odd, him being out here so late. Miss Marple thanked her, filing away each detail like a card in a catalogue. As Mrs. Phipps bustled off, Mrs. Bantry turned to her friend. You're on to something, Jane, I can tell. All these people, circling poor Thomas like crows. Who do you think did it? Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost wistful. It is too soon to say, Clara, but a farm like this, so loved, so coveted, draws out the truth in people. Their desires, their resentments. We must simply listen to what they tell us, even when they think they are saying nothing at all. They left the farmhouse, retracing their steps along the fence. Miss Marple paused again, her eyes scanning the wires. She noticed a post slightly askew, as if it had been tampered with, and a faint scuff mark in the soil nearby, too precise to be accidental. Someone has been here, she said quietly, and not for honest work. As they walked back to Rose Cottage, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the fields, Miss Marple's mind was busy. She thought of the village of St. Mary Mead, where she had seen so many dramas unfold, jealousies, greed, love turned sour. St. Mary's Down was no different, she suspected. Thomas Hale's world, with its neat fields and sturdy fences, was a stage for human passions, and his death was no mere accident. The screw in her handbag, the disturbed soil, the whispers of conflicts, they were pieces of a puzzle she would assemble with care. People, she said to Mrs. Bantry, as they reached the cottage gate, are so very careless with their secrets. And that, my dear, is where we shall find our answers. Chapter 3. The Neighbor's Grievancy. Afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the elms, as Miss Jane Marple made her way along the narrow lane toward Amos Trent's farm. Mrs. Bantry, having declared herself quite worn out from their earlier excursion, remained at Rose Cottage, leaving Miss Marple to her quiet investigations. The lane was bordered by wildflowers, their colors vivid against the green. But Miss Marple's attention was fixed on the task ahead. Amos Trent, the neighbor whose feud with Thomas Hale was the talk of St. Mary's Down, was a man whose temper, she suspected, might reveal more than he intended. She carried her black handbag, its contents now including the curious screw from Hale's fence, and her straw hat shielded her eyes as she walked with the measured pace of one who saw everything. Trent's farm, known as Stonefield, was a stark contrast to Willow Bend. Where Hale's land was orderly, Trent's was a patchwork of neglect, fences sagging, fields patchy with weeds. The farmhouse itself a squat, weathered structure with peeling paint. A rusty tractor stood idle in the yard, its wheels caked with mud, and a faint smell of oil lingered in the air. Miss Marple paused at the gate, noting the signs of a man stretched thin by circumstance. Pride, she murmured to herself, is often the last thing to go, even when all else fails. Amos Trent emerged from a shed, wiping his hands on a rag. He was a wiry man in his late 40s, with a face carved by years of sun and resentment. His eyes, narrowed under a battered cap, took in Miss Marple with suspicion. "Who are you?" Then he asked, his voice rough as the gravel underfoot. "Another of those village busybodies come to gawk." Miss Marple's smile was as gentle as a summer breeze, disarming in its simplicity. "I am Jane Marple, Mr. Trent, a visitor staying with Mrs. Bantry. I was so sorry to hear of Mr. Hale's tragedy." I thought, perhaps, to offer my condolences, and to see how his neighbor fares in such troubling times. Trent's scowl softened, but only slightly. Condolences, eh? Well, Hale and I weren't exactly mates. He's gone, and that's that. He tossed the rag onto a barrel and gestured toward the farmhouse. You'd best come in, I suppose. No sense standing in the yard. The farmhouse kitchen was dim, its air heavy with the scent of old wood and stale tobacco. A single mug sat on the table, its handle chipped, and a pile of unopened letters suggested bills left unpaid. Miss Marple settled into a creaking chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. It must be difficult, she began, living so close to such a tragedy. They say Mr. Hale was found by his fence, a terrible accident. Trent snorted, leaning against the counter. Accident. Maybe Hale was a fool with that fence, always tinkering. But he wasn't daft enough to kill himself on it. His tone was bitter, and he crossed his arms, the muscles in his forearms taut. Folks are saying it's murder. Wouldn't surprise me. Hale had enemies. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and attentive, met his. Enemies, Mr. Trent. That is a strong word. I understand you, and he had a disagreement, over a boundary, perhaps. Trent's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his gaze settling on a cracked window pane. Aye, the boundary. That strip of land along the north field bin. In my family for generations, till Hale's granddad bought it up cheap when my kin were desperate. Hale wouldn't hear of giving it back, not even a foot of it. Said it was his, fair and square. We had words more'n once. Last month, I near lost my temper proper. He paused, then added quickly, but I didn't touch him, nor his blasted fence. Of course, Miss Marple said, her voice soothing, like a nurse calming a fretful patient. These disputes can be so trying. I recall a similar matter in my own village. St. Mary met a hedge, not a fence, but oh, the trouble it caused. Tell me, Mr. Trent, were you at home the night Mr. Hale died? Trent shifted, his boots scuffing the floor. I was here, working on that tractor out there till late. It's been giving me grief, and I can't afford a new one. Didn't see nothing, didn't hear nothing. His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hands, the way his eyes flicked to the door. And did you notice anyone else about? She asked, as if it were the most natural question in the world. A car, perhaps, or someone near the boundary. Trent hesitated, his fingers tightening on the rag he'd picked up again. Can't say I did. It was dark, and I was busy. Though he trailed off, then shrugged. There's always folks poking around. That developer Voss, he's been sniffing about Hale's land for months. And young Peter, Hale's boy, he's been acting queer, always coming and going at odd hours. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind was cataloging every word. Young men can be so restless, she said. And Mr. Voss, I understand, has plans for the village. Progress, they call it. Trent's face darkened. Progress. Ruination. More like Voss wants to pave over every field, turn St. Mary's down into some city sprawl. Hale wouldn't sell, and good for him, I say. But Voss don't take kindly to know. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. If anyone had a reason to see Hale gone, it's him. Got the money, got the means. Me, I've got nothing but this farm, and it's barely holding together. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Trent's hands, rough and stained with oil, the kind of hands that knew machinery. She thought of the screw in her handbag, its metal gleaming with purpose. You know machines, Mr. Trent, she said, almost absently. Have you ever worked on an electrified fence? Trent's eyes narrowed. But he answered readily. I've got one myself, smaller than Hale's. Keep it running to stop my sheep wandering. But I don't mess with Hale's setup. He was particular about that. His tone was firm, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease, a shadow. That passed and was gone. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've been very kind, Mr. Trent, to spare me your time. I shan't keep you from your work." As they stepped outside, she paused by the tractor, its engine exposed like a patient on a surgeon's table. "Such intricate machines," she said. "They require such care, don't they? A single wrong part, and everything goes awry." Trent grunted, tossing the rag aside. "Aye, that's the truth. One bad wire, and you're done for." He turned away, but Miss Marple noted the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he avoided her gaze. As she walked back to the lane, the sun dipping toward the horizon, Miss Marple's thoughts were busy. Amos Trent was a man under pressure, his farm failing, his pride wounded by a feud that stretched back generations. His knowledge of machinery was evident, and the oil on his coat suggested recent work, perhaps late into the night, as he claimed. But his bitterness toward Hale, and his quick mention of Voss, hinted at a man eager to deflect suspicion. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a farmer's grudge over a stolen cow had led to a barn fire, carefully disguised as an accident. "People," she murmured, "are so quick to point fingers, and so slow to see their own." Back at Rose Cottage, Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her eyes alight with curiosity. "Well, Jane, what did you find? Is Trent the villain?" Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting in her lap. "Mr. Trent is a man with troubles, Clara, and a temper to match. But whether he is our villain, I cannot yet say. He knows machines, and he knew Hale's fence. Yet his anger feels personal, not calculated. We must look further, to those whose motives are less plain." Her needles began to click, a soft rhythm that belied the sharpness of her mind. The screw in her handbag, Trent's oil-stained coat, the shadow of Voss's ambition, they were threads in a tapestry, and Miss Marple was determined to see the pattern emerge. Chapter 4. The Sun's Burden. The village of St. Mary's. Down was settling into its evening rhythm as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the Green Man, the local pub where the air was thick with the scent of ale and the hum of conversation. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a sky streaked with pink and gold, and the cobblestone street glowed faintly under the lamplight. Miss Marple, her straw hat replaced by a neat shawl, moved with her usual unhurried grace, her black handbag tucked under her arm. Mrs. Bantry had offered to join her, but Miss Marple had demurred, sensing that young Peter Hale, Thomas Hale's son, might speak more freely without an audience. Young men, she had said to her friend, are often more candid when they feel unobserved. The Green Man was a cozy establishment, its low beams darkened by years of smoke, and its windows casting a warm glow onto the street. Inside, villagers gathered in small knots, their voices hushed as they discussed the tragedy at Willow Bend. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, her presence barely noted, save for a nod from Jenny, the barmaid who was polishing glasses behind the counter. Peter Hale sat alone in a corner, his broad shoulders hunched over a pint of stout. He was a handsome lad of 22, with his father's strong jaw but a restless energy that set him apart from the stolid farmers of St. Mary's Down. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and a gleam of silver caught Miss Marple's Aja wristwatch, far too fine for a farmer's son, its face glinting in the dim light. "Good evening, Mr. Hale," Miss Marple said, approaching his table with a smile that was both kind and disarming. "I am Jane Marple, a visitor to the village. May I join you for a moment? I was so very sorry to hear of your father's passing." Peter looked up, his eyes wary but softened by grief. "Miss Marple, is it I? Sit if you like. Not much for company tonight, but I suppose you mean well." His voice carried a trace of the city, a clipped edge that spoke of time spent away from the fields. Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite, her hands folded neatly in her lap, "It must be a great shock," she said gently. "Your father was so well regarded here. A man devoted to his land, they say." Peter's fingers tightened around his glass, and he took a long sip before answering. "Devoted, aye, to devoted, if you ask me. That farm was his whole world, and he thought it'd be mine too. But I'm not cut out for it, never was. All those fields, that fence, the endless work, it's a cage, not a life." His tone was bitter, and he glanced toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst in and challenge him. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and attentive, studied him. "Young men often seek their own path," she said. "I recall a lad in my village, St. Mary Mead, who left his father's shop for London. Caused quite a stir, but he found his way. Did you and your father often disagree about the farm?" Peter's gaze dropped to the table, and he traced a finger along the grain of the wood. "All the time, lately. He wanted me to take over, keep Willow Bend going forever. I told him I wouldn't. I've got plans, you see, bigger than this village. We had a row about it, just a few days back. He was shouting about duty, legacy, all that. I told him he should sell, let someone like Voss take it off his hands." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Didn't mean for him to die, though. Never that." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "It must weigh heavily, such a loss. They say it was an accident, with the fence. Were you here in the village when it happened?" Peter's eyes flicked up, then away, and he shifted in his seat. "No, I was in London. With a mate, seeing about some business. Got the train back when I heard." His words were quick, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers toyed with the watch, a nervous tick. "London is so full of opportunities," she said, as if merely making conversation. "And such a fine watch you have. A gift, perhaps." Peter's hand stilled, and a flush crept up his neck. "Bought it myself," he said, a touch defensive. "Been saving up. Not everything's about the farm, you know." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was busy. The watch was expensive, far beyond what a farmer's son might afford on savings alone, especially with Willow Bend's strained finances. She thought of the ledger she had seen in the farmhouse, its pages heavy with debt. "And did you ever meet Mr. Voss, the developer?" she asked. "He seems to have taken quite an interest in your father's land." Peter's lips pressed into a thin line. "Met him a few times. Came round the farm. All smiles and handshakes. Offered Dad a fortune to sell. I told Dad to take it, start fresh, live a bit. But he wouldn't listen. Said Voss was a snake, only out for himself." He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "If you're looking for someone to blame, you might start with him, or maybe Trent, the neighbor. He and Dad were always at each other's throats over that boundary." Miss Marple tilted her head, as if considering this. "Mr. Trent, yes. I've heard of their disagreement. And there's Mr. Finch, the mechanic, who worked on the fence. So many people in your father's world. Did you ever see Mr. Finch at the farm, perhaps working on something unusual?" Peter shrugged, his gaze drifting to the window. "Finch was around sometimes, fixing the generator or such. Didn't pay him much mind. Dad trusted him though, said he was good with machines." He drained his pint and stood abruptly. "Look, I've got to go. Got things to sort out, with Dad gone. Thanks for the chat, but I don't know nothing about that fence." Miss Marple rose as well, her smile unwavering. "Of course, Mr. Hale. You've been very kind to indulge an old woman's questions. I do hope you find some peace in this difficult time." As Peter nodded curtly and made for the door, she watched him go, noting the haste in his step, the way his hand lingered on the watch as if it were a talisman. Back at Rose Cottage, Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Well, Jane, did young Peter spill any secrets? He's a handsome lad, but there's something shifty about him, don't you think?" Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting retrieved from her bag. "Peter Hale is a young man with dreams too big for St. Mary's Down," she said, her needles clicking softly. "But dreams require money, and money can lead to compromises. That watch of his, claret's not the sort one buys on a whim. And his alibi, this London trip, feels rather too convenient." She paused, her eyes distant. "I recall a young man in St. Mary Mead, a grocer's son, who took money from a shady sort to fund his ambitions. It ended badly, as such things often do." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her scarf slipping slightly. "You think Peter's mixed up in it? Or Voss, perhaps paying him off?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost wistful. "It is too early to say, Clara. But Peter's restlessness, his expensive tastes, his talk of selling, they suggest a young man at odds with his father's world. And when worlds collide, sparks fly. We must see where those sparks lead." Her needles moved steadily, but her mind was already tracing the threads of Peter's story. The glint of his watch, and the shadow of his hurried departure from the Green Man. Chapter 5. The mechanic's craft. The morning air in St. Mary's Down carried a crisp edge, a reminder that summer, for all its warmth, was not eternal. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a light shawl and carrying her ever-present black handbag, walked the short distance to the village's sole mechanic's workshop, a squat building tucked behind the churchyard. Its corrugated roof gleamed dully under the sun, and the faint clatter of tools echoed from within. Mrs. Bantry had offered to accompany her, but Miss Marple, with a gentle smile, had suggested she stay behind to entertain the vicar's wife, who was due for tea. "Some conversations," she had said, "are best had quietly." Mrs. Bantry, though disappointed, knew better than to argue with her friend's instincts. The workshop belonged to Silas Finch, a man known for his deft hands and quiet demeanor. As Miss Marple approached, she noted the orderly chaos of the place. A bicycle propped against the wall, its chain half repaired. A tractor engine in pieces on a workbench, and coils of wire stacked in a corner, their insulation gleaming faintly. The air smelled of grease and metal, a sharp contrast to the floral sweetness of the village lanes. Finch himself was bent over a lawnmower, his wiry frame hunched, his fingers nimble as they adjusted a bolt. He was a man in his early 50s, with thinning hair and spectacles perched precariously on his nose, his overalls stained but neatly patched. "Good morning, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying the warmth of a neighbor calling for a chat. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work. I am Jane Marple, staying with Mrs. Bantry. I understand you were a friend to poor Mr. Hale." Finch straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that hung from his belt. His eyes, magnified by his glasses, were cautious but not unkind. "Miss Marple, is it? I knew Thomas Hale. Terrible thing. What happened? Not sure I'd call us friends, but I fixed his equipment now and then. What brings you here?" His tone was polite, but there was a wariness in it, like a man who preferred machines to people. Miss Marple's smile was disarming, her manner that of an elderly aunt seeking a bit of gossip. "Oh, I'm merely trying to understand the tragedy. The village is so shaken, and I thought, as someone who worked on Mr. Hale's fence, you might shed some light. Such a curious thing, a fence turning deadly." Finch's hands paused on the rag, and he glanced toward the corner where the coils of wire lay. "Curious eye," he said slowly. "I checked that fence a month back. Generator was acting up, but it was sound. Low voltage, just enough to startle the sheep. Shouldn't have been lethal, not by a long shot." He pushed his glasses up, his fingers leaving a smudge on the lens. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the workbench. Among the tools and parts, she spotted a roll of insulated wire. its gauge heavier than the fence wire she'd seen at Willow Bend. It was identical to the spliced section she'd noticed near the site of Hale's death, a detail she kept to herself. "You're so skilled with such things," she said. "I imagine it takes a great deal of knowledge to work with electrical systems. Did Mr. Hale ever ask you to modify his fence, perhaps to make it stronger?" Finch shook his head, a touch too quickly. "No, ma'am. Thomas liked things simple, said the fence was fine as it was. I just kept the generator running, replaced a few posts now and then." His eyes flicked to the door, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands, a sign of nerves cloaked in competence. "How interesting," she said, her tone as light as if she were discussing the weather. "And I understand you've been working for others in the village. Mr. Voss, perhaps. He seems a man with many projects." Finch's expression tightened, and he turned to adjust a wrench on the bench, though it needed no adjusting. I've done jobs for Voss, fixed some equipment for his construction site, bulldozers, generators, that sort of thing. Pays well, which is more'n I can say for most." His voice was gruff, but there was a defensive edge, as if he sensed the conversation veering into dangerous territory. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was sharp as ever. It must be a challenge, balancing so many tasks. "I recall a mechanic in St. Mary Mead, a clever man like yourself, who once got into a spot of trouble over a miswired motor. An accident, of course, but it caused such a stir. Have you ever worked on anything unusual for Mr. Voss? Something electrical, perhaps?" Finch's fingers froze on the wrench, and for a moment he seemed to hold his breath. "Nothing unusual," he said at last, his voice low. "Just routine repairs. Voss keeps me busy, but it's all above board." He met her eyes, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of unease, quickly masked by a forced smile. "Look, Miss Marple, I've got a lot to do here. If there's nothing else, I'd best get back to it." "Of course," she said, rising with a grace that belied her years. "You've been most kind to spare me a moment. I do hope the village settles soon, after such a shock." As she turned to leave, her eyes lingered on the roll of wire, its sheen catching the light. She thought of the transformer she'd found buried near Hale's fence, its casing new and industrial, not the sort a farmer would use. "Such a small thing, a wire," she murmured, almost to herself, "and yet, how much depends on it." As she stepped back into the sunlight, Miss Marple's thoughts were racing. Silas Finch was a man of skill, trusted by Thomas Hale to maintain the very fence that had killed him. His nervousness, the heavy gauge wire in his workshop, and his work for Voss suggested connections that were not yet clear. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a carpenter's tools had been used to stage an accident, the craftsman unaware, until too late of his role, in a darker design. "A man's craft," she said softly, "can be turned against him if another pulls the strings." Back at Rose Cottage, Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her tea with the vicar's wife concluded. "Jane, you've been ages. What did Finch say? Is he the one who rigged the fence?" Her eyes sparkled with the thrill of the mystery. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting retrieved from her bag. "Mr. Finch is a man who knows more than he says, Clara. His hands are steady with a wrench, but not with his secrets. That wire in his workshop, it's too much like the one at the fence, and his work for Mr. Voss is no coincidence, I think." Her needles clicked, a steady rhythm against the weight of her thoughts. "We must be patient, Clara. The truth is like a knot, unravels only when you find the right thread." Chapter 6. The developer's ambition. The late morning sun bathed St. Mary's, down in a golden haze, softening the edges of the village's stone walls and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, walked with Mrs. Clara Bantry toward a converted barn on the outskirts of the village, where Reginald Voss, the land developer, had set up his temporary office. The barn, once a humble structure for storing hay, now bore the marks of ambition. Its doors freshly painted, its windows fitted with modern glass, and a sleek black car parked outside, its chrome gleaming like a promise of progress. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in every detail as they approached, her black handbag swinging gently at her side. Ambition, she remarked to Mrs. Bantry, is such a curious thing. It builds and destroys in equal measure. Mrs. Bantry, her scarf, a vivid splash of crimson, nodded eagerly. Voss is the talk of the village. Jane, all his grand plans for houses and shops, some call it progress, others call it greed. And poor Thomas Hale standing in his way. Do you think he could have? She trailed off, her eyes wide with the thrill of suspicion. Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost imperceptible. We shall see, Clara. A man's plans often reveal his character, but it is his actions that tell the truth. They reached the barn, and Miss Marple knocked lightly on the door, her manner as unassuming as ever. Reginald Voss opened the door himself, a man in his early 40s with the polished air of a city gentleman. His suit was tailored, his tie a subtle shade of blue, and his smile was practiced, revealing teeth that were just a touch too perfect. Yet Miss Marple noted a faint smudge of mud on his polished shoes, an oddity for a man who seemed to avoid the dirt of the countryside. "Ladies, what a pleasure," he said, his voice smooth as polished oak. "Mrs. Bantry and Miss Marple, I presume. Do come in. I'm delighted to have visitors." The interior of the barn was a stark contrast to its rustic exterior. Blueprints and maps lined the walls, depicting rows of modern houses and a shopping arcade that promised to transform St. Mary's Down into something altogether different. A mahogany desk held a neat stack of papers, and the air carried the faint scent of expensive cologne, mingling with the musty undertone of old wood. Voss gestured to a pair of cushioned chairs, his hospitality as calculated as his decor. "Tea," he offered, already moving toward a sleek electric kettle. "Thank you, Mr. Voss," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with the grace of a guest at a vicarage tea party. "We shan't take much of your time. I understand you knew Mr. Thomas Hale, and we were so distressed to hear of his passing. Such a tragedy for the village." Voss's smile tightened, but only for a moment. "Indeed, a terrible loss," he said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "Thomas was a fine man, if a bit set in his ways. His farm was a cornerstone of this community, but progress, you know, must move forward." He handed them each a cup, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a hint of appraisal. Mrs. Bantry, never one for subtlety, leaned forward. "Progress? Yes, but at what cost? Everyone knows you wanted Hale's land, Mr. Voss. He wouldn't sell, and now he's dead. It's all very convenient, isn't it?" Voss's expression remained composed, though his fingers tightened briefly on his own cup. "Mrs. Bantry, I assure you, I had no hand in Thomas's death. Yes, I made offers for his land, generous ones, I might add. His farm is ideally situated for my development, and I believed we could reach an agreement. But I don't deal in violence. That's not my way." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the faintest edge, like a blade hidden in velvet. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "Business is business, after all. In my village, St. Mary Mead, we once had a gentleman with grand plans for a new market. Caused quite a stir, but it all came to nothing when tempers flared. Tell me, Mr. Voss, were you in the village the night Mr. Hale died? It must be so busy, with all your projects." Voss leaned back, his smile returning, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "I was in meetings, Miss Marple, with my investors in town. Left early in the morning and didn't return until the next day. A pity, really. might have seen something useful. As it is, I can only offer my sympathies." He sipped his tea, but Miss Marple noticed the way his gaze flicked to a map on the wall, where Hale's farm was marked in bold red lines. "How diligent you are," she said, her eyes following his to the map, "and such detailed plans. I suppose you work closely with local craftsmen. Mr. Finch, perhaps, the mechanic. I understand he's quite skilled with machinery." Voss's expression did not change, but his fingers paused on the cup. "Silas Finch, yes. He's done some work for me, repairs on equipment, generators, that sort of thing. Reliable man, if a bit quiet. I believe he serviced Hale's fence as well." He set his cup down, his movements deliberate. "But I'm sure you know that, Miss Marple. You seem a lady who notices things." Miss Marple's smile was serene, her knitting needles clicking in her mind though her hands were still. "Oh, I'm merely an old woman with too much time, Mr. Voss. But I do find people so interesting. Their plans, their dreams, and their shoes, sometimes." She glanced pointedly at the smudge of mud on his polished leather, her tone as light as if she were commenting on the weather. "The fields here can be so treacherous, can't they? Especially at night." Voss's smile faltered, and for a moment his composure slipped, revealing a flash of irritation. "I do walk the land occasionally, Miss Marple, part of the job. You know, surveying the terrain. Mud is an occupational hazard." He rose, signaling the end of the visit. "I'm afraid I have another appointment, ladies, but do come again. It's refreshing to meet such curious minds." As they stepped back into the sunlight, Mrs. Bantry could scarcely contain herself. "Jane, did you see that? The way he dodged your questions. And that mud on his shoes, oh, he's guilty as sin, isn't he?" Miss Marple's eyes were distant, her thoughts weaving a pattern from the threads of their conversation. "Mr. Voss is a man who plans carefully, Clara. His words are smooth, but his shoes tell a different story. And his work with Mr. Finch, there's a connection there, I think, to that unfortunate fence." She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a businessman's polished exterior had hidden a ruthless streak, uncovered only by a misplaced letter. "Ambition," she said softly, "can blind a man to the risks he takes. We must see where Mr. Voss's ambitions lead." Back at Rose Cottage, as Mrs. Bantry recounted their visit with relish, Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting in her lap. The screw from the fence, the wire in Finch's workshop, and now the mud on Voss's shoes. They were pieces of a puzzle, each fitting into place with a quiet inevitability. "People," she murmured, her needles clicking, "think. They can hide their steps, but the earth always remembers." Chapter 7. The Fence's Secret. The midday sun hung high over St. Mary's Down, casting sharp shadows across the rolling fields of Willow Bend. Miss Jane Marple, accompanied by a reluctant Constable Perkins, made her way to the site where Thomas Hale had met his untimely end. Her shawl was draped neatly over her shoulders, and her black handbag, containing the curious screw from her earlier visit, swung gently as she walked. Mrs. Bantry had been eager to join, but Miss Marple had suggested, "She'll stay behind to prepare for the village fete," sensing that the young constable might be more forthcoming without an audience. "Official matters," she had said with a gentle smile, "are sometimes best handled discreetly." Constable Perkins, his cap slightly askew, and his notebook clutched like a shield, walked beside her, his long legs slowing to match her measured pace. "Not sure what you expect to find, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with the unease of a man out of his depth. "We've been over the scene. It's a tragic accident, plain as day. The fence was live, and poor Mr. Hale got caught." Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, flickered with a quiet skepticism. "Plain as day, perhaps, but the day can hide many shadows, Constable. In my village, St. Mary Mead, we once had an accident with a faulty lamp that proved to be no accident at all. May we take a closer look at the fence? I find such things so instructive. Perkins hesitated, then nodded, leading her to the spot where Hale's body had been found. The electrified fence stretched along the edge of the field, its wires glinting in the sunlight, unremarkable save for the patch of scorched grass that marked the tragedy. A wooden post stood nearby, its base slightly worn but sturdy, and the wire was taut, connected to a small generator housed in a weathered shed a short distance away. Miss Marple paused, her gaze sweeping the scene with the precision of a seamstress examining a stitch. Such a simple device, she murmured, crouching to inspect the wire, her movements surprisingly agile for her years, meant to guide sheep, not to harm. And yet, here we are. She ran a gloved finger along the wire, stopping at a point where it seemed to join another section. The splice was subtle, nearly invisible to an untrained eye, but the wire here was thicker, its insulation glossier than the rest. How curious, she said, her voice soft but deliberate. This wire is different, Constable, heavier, newer, not the sort one uses for a livestock fence. Perkins frowned, peering at the splice. Different, you say? Well, it's all wired to me, ma'am. Silas Finch maintained it, and he'd know if something was off. Probably just a repair. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind was racing. A repair, perhaps. But let us look a little further. She followed the wire toward the ground, where the grass was disturbed, as if someone had dug recently. Kneeling carefully, she brushed away the soil, revealing a small metal box buried just beneath the surface. It was a transformer, its casing sleek and modern, unlike the rustic components of Hale's fence. A faint label, partially worn, bore the mark of an industrial supplier, not the sort found in a village shop. Now, this is most interesting, she said, her tone as mild as if she were commenting on a neighbor's roses. A transformer, Constable, and not one meant for a simple fence. This could deliver a far greater shock. Perkins's eyes widened, and he scribbled in his notebook, his earlier certainty wavering. A transformer. You're saying someone tampered with it. But who'd know how to do such a thing? Miss Marple straightened, brushing dirt from her gloves. Someone with skill, Constable. Someone who understands electricity, perhaps. Or someone who could pay for such skill. She thought of Silas Finch's workshop, the roll of heavy-gauge wire, and the faint unease in his eyes. She thought, too, of Reginald Voss's polished shoes, smudged with mud, and his ambitious plans for Hale's land. This was no accident, she said softly. This was designed to kill. Perkins paled, his cap slipping further. Murder, you mean? But that's a serious claim, Miss Marple. We'd need proof, witnesses, something solid. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind sharp as a needle. Proof. Yes, and we shall find it, Constable, by looking where others do not. She tucked the transformer's label into her handbag, alongside the screw, and turned her gaze to the horizon, where Voss's bulldozer sat idle, a silent sentinel of change. Tell me, Constable, have you spoken to Mr. Finch about his recent work? Or Mr. Voss, about his movements? Perkins shifted uncomfortably. Finch said he checked the fence a month ago, found nothing wrong. As for Voss, he claims he was in town, meeting investors. But we're a small village, ma'am. Not much in the way of witnesses out here at night. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Villages, Constable, are never as quiet as they seem. Someone always sees something, even if they don't know it yet. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a milkman's early morning rounds had revealed a crucial clue to a burglary, simply because he'd noticed a gate left ajar. We must keep looking, Constable. The fence has told us one secret. It may yet tell us more. As they walked back toward the village, Perkins trailing behind with his notebook, Miss Marple's thoughts were busy. The transformer, the spliced wire. The disturbed soil, they were not the work of a careless hand, but of someone with purpose. Someone who knew the fence's routine and Hale's habits. She thought of Amos Trent's oil-stained coat, Peter Hale's expensive watch, Finch's nervous glance, and Voss's muddy shoes. Each was a thread, and the transformer was a knot, tying them together in ways she was only beginning to unravel. Back at Rose Cottage, Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her eyes alight with anticipation. "Jane, you're back. What did you find? Was it dreadful?" She poured tea, her hands trembling with excitement. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting retrieved from her bag. "Dreadful, Clara, but illuminating. The fence was no accident, it was altered, deliberately, with a transformer meant to kill. Someone wanted Thomas Hale gone, and they knew exactly how to do it." Her needles clicked, a steady counterpoint to her words. "We are dealing with a mind that plans, Clara, and plans well. But even the cleverest plans leave traces, if one knows where to look." Chapter 8. The Village's Pulse. The Village Fete in St. Mary's. Down was a burst of color and cheer against the backdrop of recent tragedy. With bunting strung across the green and stalls laden with homemade jams and knitted scarves, the air was alive with the chatter of villagers, the laughter of children, and the occasional bleat of a sheep from a nearby pen. Miss Jane Marple, seated under a striped marquee with a cup of tea, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her shawl was draped over her shoulders, and her black handbag rested on her lap. Its contents the screw, and the transformer's label safe within. Mrs. Clara Bantry bustled about, her crimson scarf a beacon as she helped organize the cake stall, but her eyes darted frequently to Miss Marple, eager for any hint of progress in the mystery. The fete was a perfect stage for Miss Marple's purposes, a place where tongues loosened and secrets slipped out in the guise of idle gossip. She sipped her tea, her pale blue eyes scanning the crowd, noting the small interactions that revealed so much. There was Tommy Gibbs, the farmhand, lingering by the cider stall, his face still shadowed by the loss of his employer. Jenny, the barmaid, flitted between tables, her ears catching every whisper, and old Mr. Giles, the blacksmith, sat on a bench, his gnarled hands wrapped around a mug, his eyes sharp despite his years. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Mrs. Phipps, the postmistress, who approached with a tray of scones and an air of barely contained excitement. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you," she said, setting the tray down. "Such a turnout, despite poor Mr. Hale's passing. It's the talk of the village. You know everyone's got a theory." Miss Marple's smile was warm, inviting. "Confidences? I'm sure they have, Mrs. Phipps. Villages are such fertile ground for theories. Have you heard anything particularly illuminating?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were keen, like a gardener spotting a rare bloom. Mrs. Phipps leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, I shouldn't say, but I saw something odd the night before Mr. Hale died. Mr. Voss's cart, that shiny black one, was parked down the lane near Willow Bend, long after dark. He's not one to wander the fields at night, is he?" said. "He was in town, but I know what I saw." She straightened, adjusting her apron with a satisfied air. "How very interesting," Miss Marple said, her hands folded neatly. "The lanes can be so revealing, can't they? I recall a case in St. Mary Mead, where a milkman's delivery route uncovered a thief's midnight wanderings. Did you see anyone else about that night?" Mrs. Phipps thought for a moment, her brow furrowing. "Not that I recall, but young Jenny at the Green Man mentioned something curious. Said Peter Hale was in the pub a few nights back, flashing money like he'd come into a fortune. More than a farmer's son ought to have, if you ask me." She glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. "And Mr. Giles, the blacksmith, told me he saw Silas Finch buying electrical bits at the hardware shop in town. Odd things. Not his usual order." "That was just a week before the tragedy." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was cataloging each detail like a librarian sorting cards. "How observant you are, Mrs. Phipps. Such snippets are so valuable. In a small place like this." She sipped her tea, her thoughts turning to the transformer buried by the fence, its industrial label a silent accusation. "And Mr. Trent, the neighbor, has he been about today?" Mrs. Phipps sniffed, her disapproval clear. "Oh, Amos, Trent's here, skulking by the livestock pens. Still muttering about that boundary dispute, no doubt. He's not one for fates, but he's got sheep entered in the judging. Keeps to himself, mostly, since Mr. Hale died." As Mrs. Phipps moved off to serve more scones, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the pens, where Amos Trent stood, his wiry frame rigid as he watched the sheep. His face was set, his eyes darting occasionally to the crowd, as if wary of being watched. She noted, to the absence of Peter Hale and Silas Finch, though Reginald Voss was present, moving through the fete with the ease of a politician, shaking hands and offering smiles. His suit was immaculate today, no trace of mud on his shoes. But Miss Marple's memory held the image of that earlier smudge, a clue as stubborn as the man himself. She rose, making her way toward Jenny, who was now clearing empty cups from a table. "Good afternoon, Jenny," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "You must hear so much working at the Green Man. Has there been talk about Mr. Hale's accident? Young Peter, perhaps, or Mr. Voss?" Jenny blushed, her hands pausing on a tray. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all anyone talks about. Peter was in the pub a few nights before his dad died, buying rounds like he was made of money. Said he'd been in London, doing some deal. But he looked nervous, kept checking that fancy watch of his." She lowered her voice. "And Mr. Vossum say he was pressing Mr. Hale hard to sell. One of the farmhands swore he saw Vossum near the farm late one night, though he won't say it to the constable." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "How curious. And Mr. Finch? He's such a quiet man, but so skilled with machinery." Jenny nodded, her expression uneasy. "He's been odd lately, miss. Comes to the pub sometimes, but he's been keeping to himself. I heard he was working for Mr. Voss, fixing things for that big development. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting Finch to appear. "Thank you, Jenny," Miss Marple said, patting the girl's hand. "You've been most helpful." As she moved away, she spotted old Mr. Giles on his bench, his mug now empty. She approached, her smile as warm as the sun overhead. "Mr. Giles, you've seen so much in this village. Have you any thoughts on poor Mr. Hale's fence?" The blacksmith's eyes, roomy but sharp, met hers. "Fences don't kill, Miss Marple, not unless someone makes them. I saw Finch in town, buying heavy wire and some queer electrical bits. Not the sort for a sheep fence. He said it was for a job, but he wasn't happy about it. Looked like a man with a weight on his shoulders." He shook his head. "Hale was a good man, deserved better." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind weaving the threads together. Voss's car in the lane, Peter's sudden wealth, Finch's unusual purchases, and Trent's brooding presence. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a village fate had revealed a servant's theft through a careless boast overheard by a baker. "Villages," she murmured, "are like tapestries, Clara. Each thread tells a story, but only when woven together do you see the picture." Back at Rose Cottage, Mrs. Bantry pounced on her friend. "Jane, what did you learn?" The fate was buzzing with gossip. "Is it Voss, or Peter, or that Finch fellow?" Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting in her lap. "The village has spoken, Clara, and it has much to say. Mr. Voss's car, Peter's money, Finch's purchases, they are all threads leading to that deadly fence. Someone wove them together, and we are closer to knowing who." Her needles clicked, a soft rhythm against the weight of her thoughts. We must be patient, Clara. The truth is near, but it waits for us to find it. Chapter 9. The Son's Confession. The evening light filtered through the lace curtains of Rose Cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished floor, as Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual armchair, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm. Mrs. Clara Bantry, her crimson scarf slightly askew from her exertions at the village fete, bustled into the room, her face alight with anticipation. "Jane, you must tell me everything," she exclaimed, settling into a chair opposite. "The fete was positively buzzing with talk, but you were the one gathering the real secrets, weren't you?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, her eyes bright with the quiet intensity of a mind at work. "The village has been most forthcoming, Clara, but there are still threads to untangle. I think it's time we spoke again with young Peter Hale. His restlessness, his watch, there's a story there, and I believe he's ready to tell it." She set her knitting aside and rose, her movements as purposeful as ever. "Would you care to join me, or shall I call on him alone?" Mrs. Bantry waved a hand, her enthusiasm undimmed. "Oh, I'll come, Jane. I wouldn't miss it for the world. That boy's been dodging questions like a fox, but you'll get the truth out of him, I'm sure." They found Peter Hale at the Green Man, where the evening crowd was thinner, the air heavy with the scent of spilled ale and wood smoke. Peter sat in the same corner as before, his broad shoulders slumped, his expensive watch glinting under the dim lights. His glass was half empty, and his eyes, red-rimmed, suggested a sleepless night or two. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentle demeanor, her shawl draped neatly, her black handbag tucked under her arm. "Good evening, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice soft, but carrying a weight that made him look up. "May we join you for a moment? Mrs. Bantry and I have been thinking of your father, and of you." Peter's gaze flickered between them, wary, but resigned. "Not much to say, Miss Marple," he muttered, gesturing to the chairs. "But sit if you like. Everyone's got questions these days." Miss Marple settled opposite him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of kind concern. Mrs. Bantry, less restrained, perched on the edge of her seat, her eyes fixed on Peter as if he might bolt. "It's such a heavy burden, losing a father," Miss Marple began, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "And so suddenly, with all this talk of accidents. But I wonder, Peter, if there's something weighing on you, something you've not yet shared. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I once knew a young man who carried a secret, and it nearly broke him until he spoke." Peter's fingers tightened around his glass, and he stared into it as if it held answers. "What do you want from me, Miss Marple? I told you, I was in London when it happened. I didn't want him dead." His voice cracked, and he looked away, his jaw working as if wrestling with words. Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but unyielding, like a teacher coaxing a reluctant pupil. "Of course you didn't, Peter. No one thinks you meant harm. But sometimes, in our eagerness for a different life, we make choices that lead us down unexpected paths. That watch of yours, for instance, so fine, so costly. It's not the sort of thing a farmer's son might easily afford, is it?" Peter's hand jerked to the watch, his face flushing. "I told you, I bought it myself. Saved up." His voice was defensive, but there was a tremor in it, a crack in his bravado. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist, leaned forward. "Saved up, Peter. On what?" "Willow Ben's been struggling, everyone knows that. And you, flashing money at the pub like a city gent. Where did it come from, eh?" Peter's eyes darted to the door, then back to Miss Marple, who sat quietly, her gaze steady. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the murmur of the pub. Then, as if a dam had burst, Peter slumped forward, his head in his hands. "All right," he said, his voice low, broken. "I took money from Voss. He came to me a few weeks back, said he'd pay me to talk Dad into selling. Said it'd be a fresh start for me, for all of us. I tried. Miss Marple tried so hard to convince him. But Dad wouldn't budge. We fought worse than ever. That day by the barn, I told him he was throwing my future away. His voice broke, and a sob escaped him. I didn't mean for him to die. I swear it. Miss Marple's expression was one of quiet compassion, but her mind was sharp, sifting through his words. I believe you, Peter, she said softly. You wanted a different life, and Mr. Voss offered a way. But tell me, did you see anything that night? Anything at all, near the farm or the fence? Peter shook his head, his eyes glistening. I wasn't even here. I lied about London. I was at a mate's cottage, just outside the village, drinking. I couldn't face Dad again, not after our row. I only heard about it the next morning. He looked up, his face raw with grief. I'd never hurt him, Miss Marple. He was my dad. Miss Marple nodded, her hands still folded. Grief is a heavy thing, Peter, and guilt heavier still. But you've done right to tell us. Secrets have a way of festering, don't they? She paused, her eyes drifting to his watch, its silver face a silent witness to his confession. Did Mr. Voss ever mention anything about the fence, or ask you to speak to Mr. Finch, perhaps? Peter frowned, wiping his eyes. No, nothing like that. He just talked about the money, the sale, said he'd handle the rest. I didn't ask what he meant. He hesitated, then added, but I saw Finch near the farm a few days before, working on something by the shed. Thought it was just routine. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her thoughts were racing. Peter's confession had laid bare his motives, but it also pointed to Voss's deeper involvement, and perhaps Finch's unwitting role. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young man's greed had led him to accept a bribe, only to find himself entangled in a crime far greater than he'd imagined. Thank you, Peter, she said, rising. You've been very brave. Try to rest now, and leave the rest to us. As they left the pub, Mrs. Bantry could scarcely contain herself. Jane, that was masterful. He's practically confessed to taking a bribe. Do you think Voss paid him to do more than just talk? Miss Marple's eyes were distant, her mind weaving the threads of Peter's story with the clues she'd gathered. Peter is guilty of greed, Clara, but not of murder. His heart is heavy, but his hands, I think, are clean. Mr. Voss, however, grows more interesting by the moment. She thought of the transformer, the spliced wire, and the mud on Voss's shoes. We must look closer, Clara, at those who pull the strings. Back at Rose Cottage, as Mrs. Bantry recounted the encounter with relish, Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting in her lap. Young men, she murmured, her needles clicking, so often think they can outrun their troubles, but the truth has a way of catching up. Chapter 10. The mechanics slipped. The soft glow of dawn crept over St. Mary's Down, painting the rooftops with a delicate pink as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to Silas Finch's workshop. The village was still waking, the air fresh with the promise of a new day, but Miss Marple's mind was far from restful. Her black handbag, now a repository of clues to screw, the transformer's label hung at her side, and her shawl was drawn tightly against the morning chill. Mrs. Bantry had protested at being left behind again, but Miss Marple had insisted, her gentle smile masking a firm resolve. Mr. Finch, she had said, is a man who speaks best when not overwhelmed. A quiet word may loosen his tongue. The workshop was much as she had left it, its corrugated roof catching the first rays of sun, the air within heavy with the scent of grease and metal. Silas Finch was already at work, his wiry frame bent over a tractor engine, his spectacles glinting as he adjusted a bolt. The roll of heavy-gauge wire still sat in the corner, a silent echo of the spliced section at Hale's fence. Miss Marple knocked lightly on the open door, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. "Good morning," Mr. Finch, she said, her voice warm but carrying a subtle weight. I hope I'm not disturbing you so early. Finch looked up, his hands pausing on the wrench. His face, lined with the wear of years, showed a flicker of unease, quickly masked. Miss Marple, back again. You're an early riser, aren't you? He wiped his hands on his rag, his movements deliberate. What's on your mind today? Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes sweeping the workshop with a practiced ease. I've been thinking about poor Mr. Hale, she said, settling onto a stool near the workbench. That fence of his, so simple, yet so deadly. I found something curious there, Mr. Finch. A transformer, buried by the wire, not at all the sort meant for livestock, and the wire itself thicker, newer, like the one you have here. She gestured to the roll in the corner, her tone as mild as if discussing a recipe. Finch's fingers tightened on the rag, and his spectacles slipped slightly down his nose. A transformer, you say? His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted to the wire and back. I don't know anything about that. I fixed Hale's generator last month, like I told you. Everything was in order. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes unwavering. Of course, Mr. Finch, you're so skilled, and Mr. Hale trusted you. But I wondered, did anyone else ask you to work on something electrical, perhaps for a different project? Mr. Voss, for instance. He seems to rely on your expertise. Finch's face paled, and he turned to adjust a tool on the bench, though it needed no attention. Voss, I've done jobs for him, repairs, mostly, for his construction site. Nothing out of the ordinary. His voice was tight, and Miss Marple saw the sweat beading on his brow. Despite the cool morning air. How interesting, she said, her tone as light as a summer breeze. In my village, St. Mary Mead, we had a mechanic once who was asked to fix a machine, only to find it was used for something quite different. Tell me, Mr. Finch, did Mr. Voss ever ask you to supply parts wire, perhaps, or a transformer for one of his projects? Finch's hands froze, and for a moment he seemed to struggle for words. Then, as if a weight had become too heavy to bear, he slumped against the workbench, his spectacles fogging slightly. All right, Miss Marple, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I supplied parts to Voss, wire, a transformer's industrial stuff, for what he said was a new generator at his site. He paid me well, told me not to ask questions. I didn't know it'd be used like that. His eyes met hers, filled with a mix of fear and shame. I swear, I didn't know it'd hurt Thomas. Miss Marple's expression was one of quiet compassion, but her mind was sharp, piecing together the puzzle. I believe you didn't mean harm, Mr. Finch, but that transformer, it was found at Mr. Hale's fence, wired to kill. Did you install it there, under Mr. Voss' instructions? Finch's hands shook, and he pushed his spectacles up, his voice breaking. I lied it. Voss said it was for a temporary setup, something about testing equipment. He showed me where to put it, near the fence, said it'd be moved later. I didn't think to check the voltage. I just did what he paid me for. He looked down, his shoulders sagging. Thomas was a good man. If I'd known, I'd never have touched it. Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded in her lap. A man's skills can be his undoing, Mr. Finch, when guided by another's intent. You've done right to tell me. The truth, though painful, is always the better path. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly as she moved toward the door. You must tell Constable Perkins everything, Mr. Finch. It will help set things right. Finch nodded, his face ashen. I will, Miss Marple. I never meant for this. I needed the money. His voice was barely audible, and Miss Marple saw the weight of his guilt, heavy as the tools around him. As she stepped back into the dawn light, Her thoughts were racing. Finch's confession had confirmed the transformer's origin, linking it to Voss's ambitions. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's innocent repair of a gate had been twisted into a trap by a cunning employer. The innocent, she murmured, are so often caught in the webs of the guilty. Back at Rose Cottage, Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Jane, you look like you've caught a fox. What did Finch say? Is he the killer?" Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting retrieved from her bag. "Mr. Finch is no killer, Clara, but he has played a part, unwitting though it was. He supplied the tools for Mr. Hale's death, at Mr. Voss's bidding. The web tightens, Clara, and I believe we are close to its center." Her needles clicked, a steady rhythm against the weight of her thoughts. "We must see Mr. Voss again, and soon. His plans, I think, are beginning to unravel." Chapter 11. The developers masked the afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Rose Cottage, casting a warm glow over the chintz curtains and the polished oak table where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles pausing as she considered her next move. Mrs. Clara Bantry, her crimson scarf a vivid splash against her tweed jacket, was pacing with barely contained excitement. "Jane, you've got Finch's confession," she exclaimed, her hands fluttering. "That transformer, Voss's orders, it's all coming together. You must confront that developer fellow now, mustn't you?" Miss Marple's pale blue eyes twinkled faintly, but her expression remained serene. "Confrontation. Clara is a blunt tool. Mr. Voss is a man of polish and calculation. We must approach him with care, lest he slip through our fingers." She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her shawl. "Let us invite him here for tea. A cozy setting often loosens the tongue, and I believe Mr. Voss has much to say, whether he knows it or not." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands, delighted by the prospect. "Oh, brilliant, Jane. I'll send a note at once. He won't dare refuse a tea invitation from Rose Cottage." She bustled off to dispatch the message, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The screw, the transformer's label, and now Finch's confession were pieces of a puzzle, and Reginald Voss, with his muddy shoes and ambitious plans, stood at its heart. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a charming newcomer's smooth words had hidden a deadly intent, revealed only by a misplaced receipt. "The cleverest masks," she murmured, "are the ones we think we see through." By 4 o'clock, Reginald Voss arrived at Rose Cottage, his sleek black car pulling up with a quiet purr. He stepped out, his tailored suit immaculate, his smile as polished as ever, though Miss Marple noted a faint tension in his jaw, a crack in his usual composure. The mud on his shoes was gone, replaced by a mirror-like shine, but she remembered its earlier presence, a silent witness to his nocturnal wanderings. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," he greeted, his voice smooth as silk. "What a charming invitation. I trust you're enjoying your time in St. Mary's Down." Mrs. Bantry, playing her part with gusto, ushered him into the drawing room. "Oh, Mr. Voss, we're quite settled, though this dreadful business with poor Thomas Hale has us all in a tizzy. Tea." She poured from a china pot, her hands steady despite her excitement. Miss Marple, seated by the window, offered a gentle smile. "We're so grateful you could spare a moment, Mr. Voss. The village is still reeling from Mr. Hale's tragedy, and we thought you, with your keen interest in his land, might have some insight." Her tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp, watching his every move. Voss sipped his tea, his movements deliberate. A tragedy indeed. Thomas was a stubborn man, but I respected his attachment to his land. I had no part in his death, if that's what you're implying. His smile was tight, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers gripped the cup, betraying a flicker of unease. "Of course not," she said, her voice as soothing as a summer breeze. "But I've been thinking about that fence, Mr. Voss. So, simple, yet so deadly. We found a transformer buried nearby. You see, not the sort for a livestock fence, but one capable of a lethal shock. And the wire, spliced with a heavier gauge, much like the kind Mr. Finch supplied for your projects. She paused, letting the words settle like dust in sunlight. Curious, isn't it, how such things come together? Voss's composure wavered, his eyes narrowing slightly. I know nothing about transformers, Miss Marple. I hire men like Finch to handle such details. If there was tampering, it's news to me. He set his cup down, his movements precise. But strained Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist, leaned forward. But your car, Mr. Voss. Mrs. Phipps saw it near Willow Bend that night, when you said you were in town. And your shoes, all muddy when we last met, hardly the sort of thing for a man who avoids the fields. Voss's smile returned, but it was colder now, like frost on a window pane. Mrs. Phipps must be mistaken. I was in meetings, as I told the constable. As for my shoes, I do walk the land occasionally, it's part of my work. You're building quite a tale, ladies, but it's all conjecture. He leaned back, his confidence returning. Though Miss Marple saw the pulse at his temple, quickening slightly, she tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity. Conjecture, perhaps, but the village sees much. Mr. Voss, and Mr. Finch, has been most forthcoming. He told us of the transformer he installed at your request, near Mr. Hale's fence. He believed it was for your construction site, but it seems it served a darker purpose. Her voice was soft, but each word was a needle, pricking at his facade. Voss's face hardened, and for a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then he laughed, a short brittle sound. Finch is mistaken, or lying to cover his own mistakes. I paid him for repairs, nothing more. You're grasping at shadows, Miss Marple. But his eyes betrayed him, darting to the door as if calculating an escape. Miss Marple's smile remained serene, her hands folded in her lap. Shadows, Mr. Voss often reveal the truth. I recall a gentleman in St. Mary Mead, so charming, so sure of himself, until a single letter undid him. You wanted Mr. Hale's land, and he stood in your way. A small thing, a fence, but so effective when altered by a clever hand. She paused, her gaze steady. The mud on your shoes, the transformer, Finch's work, they tell a story, don't they? Voss rose abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. This is absurd. I've no time for village gossip or old ladies playing detective. Good day. He strode to the door, but Miss Marple's voice, soft yet piercing, stopped him. The truth, Mr. Voss, has a way of catching up. Constable Perkins will be most interested in what we've found. She said no more, but her eyes held his, and in that moment, she saw the mask slip a flash of fear. Raw and unguarded, as Voss left, his car roaring to life outside. Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple, her face alight with triumph. Jane, you had him on the ropes. He's guilty, isn't he? That look in his eyes? Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting retrieved. Mr. Voss is a man under pressure, Clara, and pressure reveals cracks. His denials are strong, but his fear is stronger. We are close, I think, to the heart of this. Her needles clicked, a steady rhythm, against the weight of her thoughts. One more step, Clara, and the truth will stand clear. Chapter 12. The truth unfenced. The village hall of St. Mary's Down was abuzz with a quiet tension, its wooden beams and faded bunting from the recent fete lending a somber air to the gathering. The late afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor where Miss Jane Marple stood, her shawl neatly draped, her black handbag at her side. Constable Perkins, his cap now firmly in place, had summoned the key figures in Thomas Hale's death: Amos Trent, Peter Hale, Silas Finch, and Reginald Voss, to the hall, at Miss Marple's gentle but insistent urging. Mrs. Clara Bantry stood. Nearby, her crimson scarf, a vivid contrast to the muted tones of the room, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. The villagers, gathered in small clusters, whispered among themselves. Sensing that the truth was about to be laid bare, Miss Marple stepped forward, her presence as unassuming as ever, yet commanding the room with the quiet authority of one who saw through the veils of human deceit. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of certainty. "The death of Mr. Thomas Hale has cast a shadow over St. Mary's Down, and it is time we brought light to it. What seemed an accident was no accident at all, but a carefully planned act, woven with skill and ambition." Constable Perkins, clutching his notebook, nodded nervously. "Miss Marple's found some things. You see evidence that points to foul play. We're here to sort it out." His voice faltered, but Miss Marple's calm gaze steadied him. She turned to the gathered suspects, her eyes sweeping over each in turn. Amos Trent stood rigid, his wiry frame tense, his scowl deepening as if bracing for accusation. Peter Hale, pale and drawn, fidgeted with his expensive watch, his grief raw but tempered by guilt. Silas Finch, his spectacles slipping down his nose, looked at the floor, his hands twisting a rag as if it could shield him. Reginald Voss, his suit as polished as ever, maintained a facade of confidence, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand, the way his eyes avoided hers. "Let us begin with the fence," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as if discussing a neighbor's garden. A simple device, meant to guide sheep, yet altered to deliver a lethal shock. A transformer, buried by the wire, and a heavier gauge of wire spliced into the line. These were no accidents. They were the work of someone with knowledge and intent. She drew the transformer's label from her handbag, its industrial mark stark in the soft light. "This was found at the scene, and it tells a story." She turned to Silas Finch, her gaze kind but unyielding. "Mr. Finch, you are a man of skill, trusted by Mr. Hale to maintain his fence. You told me you supplied a transformer and wire to Mr. Voss, believing them for his construction site. You installed them near the fence, at his direction, unaware of their true purpose. Is that not so?" Finch's shoulders slumped, his voice barely audible. "I, Miss Marple, I did as he asked. I didn't know it'd kill Thomas. I swear it." His confession hung in the air, and the villagers murmured, their eyes turning to Voss. Miss Marple's attention shifted to Peter Hale. "And you, Peter, took money from Mr. Voss to persuade your father to sell your dreams of a life beyond. The farm led you to a bargain, but not to murder. Your grief is real, and your hands are clean of that act." Peter's head bowed, tears glistening, and a sigh of relief escaped him, though the weight of his choices remained. She turned to Amos Trent, whose scowl had softened into unease. "Mr. Trent, your feud with Mr. Hale was bitter, rooted in old grievances over land. But your anger, though fierce, was not the kind to plot such a cunning death. Your hands, too, are stained with oil, not blood." Trent's eyes widened, and he nodded gruffly, his defiance giving way to gratitude. Finally, Miss Marple faced Reginald Voss, her voice as steady as her gaze. "Mr. Voss, your ambition for Willow Bend was no secret. You wanted Mr. Hale's land, and he stood firm against you. You paid Peter to sway him, but when that failed, you turned to a darker plan. You used Mr. Finch's skills, directing him to install a transformer and wire that would turn a simple fence into a weapon. Your car was seen near the farm that night, your shoes bore the mud of the fields, and the transformer's label traces to a supplier you use for your projects." She held up the label, its evidence irrefutable. Voss's face paled, his smile vanishing like mist in sunlight. "This is preposterous," he began, but his voice cracked, and the villagers' murmurs grew louder. "You have no proof, just an old woman's fancies." Miss Marple's smile was serene, her eyes piercing. The proof is here, Mr. Voss, in the transformer, the wire, and Mr. Finch's testimony. And in the village's eyes, which saw your car, your movements. I recall a case in St. Mary Mead, where a man's ambition led him to a crime he thought undetectable, until the smallest details betrayed him. You planned to force the sale of Willow Bend, but you underestimated the truth. Voss's shoulders sagged, and he sank into a chair, his polished facade crumbling. I only wanted the land, he said, his voice hollow. Hale was stubborn. Ruining everything, I thought. A scare, a push. I didn't mean for him to die. His confession, quiet but damning, silenced the room. Constable Perkins stepped forward, his notebook trembling but his resolve firm. Mr. Voss, you'll come with me. We've got enough to hold you. As Voss was led away, the villagers erupted. In whispers, their shock mingling with relief. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Bantry, who was beaming with triumph. Jane, you've done it. You caught him, just like that. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting retrieved from her bag. People, Clara, so often forget that progress built on harm is no progress at all. Mr. Voss's ambition was his undoing, as it so often is. Her needles clicked, a soft rhythm against the fading light, as the village of St. Mary's Down began to heal from the shadow of its loss.